Problem 29A walks us through utilizing all four of the decision tools that we have talked about in this chapter: the payback method, the accounting rate of return, net present value, and the internal rate of return, along with the profitability index when we have decisions that are not made using the same assumptions. So let's begin with Water Country, who is considering the purchase of a water park in Atlanta, Georgia for $1,850,000. They have estimated that the park would generate cash inflows of $475,000 for 8 years. They think that the project as it is now, the water facility, would be useful for 8 years. It would have no residual value at the end of 8 years. And the stockholders demand an annual rate of return of 12% on investments such as this. So if we walk through each step of each of the tools that we could use in, is the investment in this water park a good idea? Well, let's begin with the payback period. Remember, the payback period, we simply want to know how long will it take us to recover enough cash flow to pay off our initial investment in this water park. So we know our amount invested was $1,850,000. And they told us that our expected annual cash flows, so we're not looking at total, but our annual cash flows are $475,000. So with this in mind, we would take around 4 years, 3.9 years, to generate enough cash flow to cover our initial investment of $1,850,000. Now, if the cash flows were not the same every single year, we would simply add the cash flows and divide by the number of years that they are coming in. This is the simplest form of the problem. So is the payback period a good period? Well, what we know is that the payback period is around 4 years, and we estimate that the park would be in existence and generating cash inflows for 8 years. So at this point, without any additional tools, it does seem like it could potentially be a good investment. But let's look at some other tools. Let's look at the accounting rate of return. So we need to know the total number of cash flows, during the operating life of the facility. So we're looking at our total cash inflows, and this was the $475 times 8 years, $3.8 million. Remember, we want, since this is the accrual basis of accounting, we want to back out any non-cash related expenses such as depreciation. So we take our total cash inflows from the cost savings and revenue that we'll generate. This is our net cash inflows per year. We subtract our depreciation of $1,850,000 when we have our total. And so what I can decipher from this is that my total operating income over the life of this asset is around $1,950,000. And if I divide that by my 8 useful years, then the average operating income from the facility is around $243,750. So once again, we only can determine that this is positive, not necessarily that it's good or bad, but that it is positive. But if I have other assumptions or other parks that I'm considering investing in, this would be a good comparison. So now that I know the average amount of operating income, I want to determine the average amount invested, which is simply the $1,850,000 plus any residual value, but they told us the park wouldn't have any residual value. So I have to calculate my average amount invested. It is simply the $1,850,000 divided by 2. Now I have what I need for the accounting rate of return. I know the annual operating income from the facility. I know the average amount that I have invested, and this will generate for us an accounting rate of return of around 26.3%. Once again, it is positive, but what is our minimum required return to take on investments such as this? And I think it was around 12% for this organization. So we could see that this is well above the minimum amount. Once again, these are the quantitative factors that help us to discern, should we move, if we had a plethora of investment decisions that we were considering, would we move them on into the next phase of analysis or capital rationing? And could there be other qualitative factors that would cause us to reconsider? This is the water park industry, but the golfing industry is going through a significant shift with the economy changing as it has. And so organizations have to think about, where is the economy going, and how much excess cash or discretionary income do people have to spend on entertainment. And this is also obviously going to come into play with the estimated cash flows that we think we can generate each year. But if there is something that we anticipate happening in the economy, if there is some type of stigma that might come along with the sport that could impact what we're doing, if it puts employees that would be in this facility in danger, those are all qualitative factors that we would need to consider. But right now we have two positive aspects. We have a shorter payback period than we do operational life, and we have an accounting rate of return that is higher than our minimum. So let's look at the net present value calculation. This one is fairly simple because I have cash inflows. My time is 8 years. My principal is actually an annuity of $475,000 a year for 8 years with an expected rate of return of 12%. So I can go to my annuity table. I can find 12% over 8 years to find my annuity factor of 4.968. Times the cash flows that I bring in each year tells me that I would bring in the present value of $2,359,800, and this is above the initial investment. So I also can identify a positive net present value for my facility. If I bring all of the cash inflows from my organization to their present value, that exceeds the present value that I'm going to be investing in my organization initially. Now, what about the internal rate of return? This simply tells me that with a positive present value, that my rate of return is somewhere above the required minimum of 12%. But how do I know what that rate of return actually is? So we begin our calculation simply by, up here our formula was, we have an annuity, and we wanted to multiply that annuity times a factor to come up with a present value. Well, in this situation, we know our initial investment and we know our cash flows. And so we're trying to determine what will it take to get these cash flows to equal this initial investment over an 8-year period of time, but at what rate? So we're solving for that interest rate. So if I take my initial investment of $1,850,000, I divide by my estimated inflows, I come up with an annuity factor of 3.895. So if I go to my annuity table and I scan down the 8-year column looking for this factor, I'm going to find it doesn't land exactly in my table, but it does land somewhere between 18% and 20%. Okay, so once again, what I can conclude from this test is that the rate of return, the internal rate of return that would cause the present value of my cash inflows to equal the present value of my investment is going to fall somewhere between 18% and 20%, because I'm looking for 3.895, which will fall somewhere between the 3.8 and the 4.078%. Now, if we have a business calculator or Microsoft Excel, we can actually calculate this, or if you know how to interpolate, you could actually calculate that it is 19.5%. This is our internal rate of return. So at that rate of return, the cash flows that I'm going to generate from this water park in 8 years would equal $1,850,000 if my rate of return was 19.5%. Okay, so now I know that anything above 19.5% is going to be positive for this is going to be encouraging for this situation, and our actual rate of return that we had calculated above was 26%. All right, let's take a look finally at the profitability index. So we don't have multiple situations to compare here, but it still allows you to walk through the calculation of a profitability index. So what is the present value of all the net cash inflows of my organization? And I am dividing by the present value of my initial investment. And so my profitability needs to be at least 1. So with a rate of return of 19.5%, the present value of my cash flows should equal my initial investment, I would have a profitability index of 1. So in this situation, we know that we have more cash flows cash inflows than we are initially going to be out for our investment. And so it is above 1. It is at 1.28%. And in summary, as we've mentioned going through, the payback period is less than the operating period. That's a positive. The net present value is positive, so that exceeds the minimum rate of return that this organization expects for this type of investment. The profitability index is greater than 1 because it is profitable. The higher it is, the better it is. The accounting rate of return of 26% and the internal rate of return of 19.5% are obviously greater than the required rate, which I think was somewhere around 12. So all of these factors are positive factors in trying to identify whether a company should invest in this water park. But once again, I have all the quantitative data at this point. I have to stop and take into consideration qualitative factors as well that could still cause me to reject this potential decision, even though the quantitative factors are positive.